Today, you're going to need to grab one sheet of paper off of the supply table. Please be careful with this paper. It's very nice paper. It is watercolor paper, which means that it's kind of thick and it's specifically designed for watercolor, which means it's also expensive, so please be careful with it. You're also going to need to grab one paintbrush, and everything else you should be at your table. Like always, we always start with our name on the back of our paper, and you're my 2, and then whatever class you're in. Flip it over. We saw with Monet's lily pond that a lot of times we saw some vegetation around the pond, or things like lilies or vines or grass. So using your crayons, you're going to want to pick out some different greens. Don't use all the same greens. Use a variety. And start off by drawing some lily pads. Lily pads are just going to be ovals. Think about space as well. If you have a lily pad that's close to you, it's going to be bigger. Remember that if it's close, it's going to be lower on my paper. As they get further away, they're going to get smaller and smaller. I'm going to do my lily pads to about halfway up my paper. Use some other greens. Alright, so I've got some lily pads added. Next, I'm going to use some colors to add the little lilies. You probably want to consider using colors like purple, red, and pink would all be good for this. I'm going to make a little U shape, and I do a smaller U shape inside that. Not every lily pad needs a flower. Remember, when you get really far away, there's going to be like little dots almost. Once again, don't just stick with one color, switch it up. Alright, so I'm done with my lilies. Now I can add some grass. The grass is just kind of some lines coming up from the bottom, kind of curved, kind of going different directions. Sometimes they overlap. Same as going up the side of my paper. Going up the other side of my paper. Once again, use different colored greens. Overlap these different greens, and it's going to create that sense of space or depth. Like some of these greens are close, some are far, some might have the sun on them. And don't forget to add some vines as well. Vines are just kind of like squiggle lines hanging down. Don't overdo it with these little details. Alright, after I have my lilies done, the flowers on them done, and I've got the grass going up the sides, and my vines, I am ready to move on to the last step of the project today. We're going to do a watercolor technique called wet on wet. You did this as first graders already, so this shouldn't be too new to you, but you're going to get your brush nice and wet with water. I'm going to paint about half of my paper with just that water. The reason I'm only doing half is because I don't want my paper to dry before I can get to it. So it's nice and wet. You might have to go over it a couple times. Now I'm going to use cool colors to paint in that water. So you might use some greens. So I'm just kind of tapping it. I'm not painting it. I'm hardly even touching my paper. I might use some blues. And of course I can use some yellows as well. It's okay if there's some white showing, that's fine. Alright, now I'm ready to do the bottom half. Once again, cleaning out my brush, get it nice and wet. Just water. you'll notice that the lily pads and the grass and vines will show up pretty well. And that's because wax and water do not get along very well. So that crayon is going to keep showing through, especially after it dries. And I'm just painting lightly, adding some color where I want to. Alright, so I've got the entire thing painted now. So first I used crayon, then I painted using wet on wet. Remember, that means you're putting water on your paper, so your paper's wet. Then you're using watercolor paints. The very last thing I'm going to do is etch table there are little cups of salt. You can take that salt and add a couple little pinches around your paper. What this is going to do is that salt is going to suck up some of the water, and it's going to make kind of a cool effect when this dries. Don't overdo it with the salt. If you do too much, you're going to have stinky artwork and it no longer looks cool. So you can see where mine is. I didn't put a whole lot on. When you're done, this goes on the drying rack as low as it can go. Make sure that it goes on top of your messy paper too when you put it in there.